I had been encountering references to Khmelnytsky in very different ways across the literature that I was reading. Some of them came in the form of Sholem Aleichem stories. Sholem Aleichem has a wonderful story from his railway stories, and another good suggestion for future reading, where a shtetl, a town full of Jews, has heard that a pogrom is on its way, and they're waiting and waiting, and the pogrom never arrives because someone forgets to hitch the train car to another train car. But along the way, the town is waiting for a group of Cossacks from Tulchin to arrive, who are supposed to help to defend the town against the pogromchiks. And these Cossacks from Tulchin, of course, it's a sort of ironic comment because, of course, Tulchin was one of the sites of the Khmelnytsky uprising where many Jews were killed. But it's also a reference to the potential alliance between Ukrainians and Jews in the face of other threats. And then, you encounter in Isaac Babel, just along the way, as Lyutov, the main character in the Red Cavalry stories, is riding together with his Cossack soldier colleagues, they come to Berestechko, and they all have to pause with a moment of silence for Khmelnytsky's defeat at Berestechko. And this is part of this story, which is equally a Jewish story and a Ukrainian story. And I continued to encounter these modern references to the Khmelnytsky uprisings, and wanted to look at the history of Khmelnytsky face on, because in Jewish stories, it's just assumed that Khmelnytsky is an evil figure of biblical proportions, a precursor to Hitler, a horrible character. Whereas in the Ukrainian tradition, Khmelnytsky carved out the Ukrainian territory. He's the closest we come to the nation builder, the tantamount to a George Washington. And so what do we do with this figure? Is he a hero? Is he a villain? Is there any way of reconciling these two stories? So again, I'm looking at myths. And the Khmelnytsky book arose out of a desire to try to hold these myths up against one another. And I initially, actually, there was a moment when I thought about trying to write this book myself and realized that, first of all, I'm a scholar of modern literature. To go back to the 17th century would require an entire re-education for me. It would also require a lot of language training. I would need to be able to read Polish. I would need to be able to read biblical Hebrew with the kind of fluency that I'm able to bring to the Russian and Yiddish texts that I treat. And so instead, I assembled a volume with a really wonderful group of scholars. And the idea behind this volume was to analyze the stories about Bohdan Khmelnytsky within their own contexts. And we focused on literature, and we have historians and scholars of literature who examined the very early stories of Khmelnytsky and those that are looking at contemporary portrayals. But again, the idea was to, without whitewashing the history of Ukrainian Jewish animosity, to look at some of the fascinating intersections of Ukrainian Jewish history of coexistence, and to think about what the lessons might be for us today. Well, the entire book is meant to address a stereotype. The entire book is meant to address stereotypes on all directions and to bring, again, these stories together. And it's also a case study in a charismatic figure who has remained a hero in one tradition and a villain in another. And in fact, Khmelnytsky is even more than that. He has a very complicated role in Polish history and historical memory. He has a complicated role in Russian historical memory. For the most part, Khmelnytsky is seen as a great unifier in Russian historical and literary tradition. Khmelnytsky was the one that brought the, Rus together, right? Or that helped to make that happen. And so I primarily was trying to struggle with the blanket assumption in Jewish literary tradition that the only, or let's just say Jewish cultural tradition, that the only way of looking at Ukraine and Ukrainians was through the lens of pogroms, right? Khmelnytsky being the first and the greatest of all of the pogromchiks. And on the other hand, I think that there are negative stereotypes about Jews that are also perpetrated in part because of the legacy of Khmelnytsky. There was this idea that Khmelnytsky was rising up against Poland, who, with its allies, the Jewish leaseholders, was subjugating the peasants of the time. And the scholars that wrote chapters for this book all did a really nice job of internally to each chapter complicating their own case studies. So, for example, Adam Teller, who writes the first chapter for the book, has a really wonderful study of Nathan Hanover and discusses in detail Hanover's treatment of Khmelnytsky as a figure, but also as the Ukrainian peasants. And in some senses, Hanover is giving a bit of credit to the peasants for their need to rise up. And, this return to Hanover in light of a Ukrainian project, I think has helped to situate him together with some of the early Ukrainian and Polish chronicles about the Khmelnytsky uprising as well. So that's, I think partly self-consciously each of the chapters had to speak to whoever is not usually their readership. And I think although each of the scholars included in this book is well known in their own right and, has been doing work on the subject for a long time, I think by having to speak to a much wider readership, it created perhaps a really interesting juxtaposition of their work. What came out of this project for me was an appreciation of the extent to which my colleagues who were part of this project really were already working across that border. I think everyone who's treating Ukraine in the context of this book from the Jewish studies angle is already conscious of Ukrainian scholarship and of this concern about the history of Ukrainian nationhood and vice versa. I think that the scholars of Ukraine that entered this project have been reading and thinking about Jewish studies scholars. I came to this project with an interest in approaches to literature as a reworking of memory theory as well. I'm very interested in and influenced by theorists of memory and theorists of collective memory. And I think once you move beyond the scholars that are already engaged in the field, you have myths that continue to be repeated and perpetrated within individual groups. So, for example, in Jewish collective memory, Khmelnytsky becomes the charismatic representative of a very difficult moment for the Jews. And so part of what the book does is it just teases out, well, it was actually a whole moment. It was the moment when the Khmelnytsky uprising took place, and it wasn't necessarily Khmelnytsky himself who was going around with a sword, but a number of different people under his command. I mean, that's an easy part of history to clarify. But I was interested in revisiting collective memory from the perspective of multiple collectivities. So what would a group of Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and Russians have to say about this history if they got together in one room? So my own project, I can speak a little bit about that portion of it. This is one of the reasons that I got into the project at all. Involved a retelling of of one story from Hanover, the Tulchin episode from Hanover, by a late 19th century Russian language Jewish-born playwright, Nikolai Minsky. And Minsky was a kind of proto-symbolist. He was born to Jewish parents, but converted to Christianity. And Minsky was very interested. He remained very interested in Jewish history. And so in the late 1880s, he wrote this play called Osada Tulchina, or The Siege of Tulchin, where he took Hanover's account of the Tulchin episode, and this was probably through a recent Russian translation of Hanover that had come out, as well as some histories that had been published and republished. And he dramatized it and added his own embellishment. So Minsky has a Spanish Jewish sort of Sephardic character who finds out that he has converso roots, goes and gets an Orthodox Jewish conversion and in Amsterdam, and in hearing about the struggle of his brethren in Poland, comes down to fight against the Khmelnytsky and his Cossacks with the Jews of Tulchin. And so you have this Spanish hero that has to fight for a group of subordinated Ukrainian Jews, Ukrainian or Polish Jews, depending on how you draw the border. And so it's a very interesting story because he has to write in this heroic Sephardic figure. But what's very fascinating about it is that he's drawing from a couple of different episodes in Hanover's chronicles, and creating this tale of Jewish spiritual heroism and also of Russian heroism, because ultimately it's this sort of the characters that look the worst in his play are the Polish characters. But what becomes very interesting for me is that this play is translated into Yiddish shortly after the next major outbreak of pogroms in Ukraine. So right after the Chisinau and Gomel pogroms, it's translated into Yiddish in Warsaw, and shortly after that, Sholem Asch, who is a modern Yiddish writer, so now we're getting into the 1910s and 20s, writes a short Yiddish novella called Kiddush Hashem, which again returns to the Nemirov and Tulchin episodes in the Khmelnytsky uprisings. And it seems to me that Sholem Asch is actually directly drawing from Minsky's story. So it takes several incarnations of this original episode in Hanover, and characters are added, and episodes from the chronicles are combined. Different people die, different people are saved, until we get to our most modern incarnation, which is Sholem Asch's story. And Sholem Asch's story becomes very famous in English as well as Yiddish, and becomes a story that's repeated several times, especially during the Holocaust, as an example of Jewish heroism in the face of mass murder. So you see this continuity through translation, and in some cases through adaptation, that takes place in response to several different events that happen along the way. So that's my contribution to the volume, in addition to just putting the volume together. And even approaching writing this book, several of the scholars that were part of the project really helped me to put this together, to conceptualize it. One of it was Frank Sysyn, who has a chapter on the Rabyanka. Really fantastic chapter. And Frank also, worked with me, helped to edit my introduction, worked with me on a chronology. So really helped to make the book relevant to a Ukrainian readership, and just to a readership of historians as well. George Grabowicz also worked with me in initially conceiving of the project and deciding whom to invite. Adam Teller, who wrote the first chapter of the book about the Hanover Chronicles, also read drafts of things for me. So it was really it was one of those experiences you don't expect to have in putting together a volume, in that many of my colleagues who contributed really served in adversarial roles for the volume. Taras Koznarsky, who's also in Canada with you, wrote a chapter on Romanticism, and he and I together did an extensive works cited, and since then have put together an even more extensive bibliography with hypertexts to online resources on Khmelnytsky, which should be coming out very soon with Oxford. Oxford has an online bibliography reference resource. And so Taras and I, as an extension of this project, put together detailed annotated bibliography. So it was really a very collaborative effort. Some of the more offbeat chapters were the chapters that I had the most fun reading and learning from. One of them, for example, was Gennady Estreich, my colleague at NYU, who also works on Yiddish literature, wrote a chapter about the Order of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in the Red Army. And this is about an award that was given for heroism after World War II. And it was, of course, the Order of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, meant to honor Ukrainian-born Soviet citizens, but was occasionally awarded to Jews. And so he discussed this, the history of this medal that was given and what that meant for the Ukrainian and Jewish, and especially the Jewish recipients of the medal. So really, that kind of thing, which really kind of mixes up the basic mythology premise of the volume, I think made it a relevant book to popular culture and to the history of popular culture as well as to literary studies. Any academic, especially one working on Eastern Europe, which is important to me. It's dear to me. It's a place that was born in California, fell in love with Russian literature. That was how I began studying Russian. Russia is dear to my heart. Ukraine is dear to my heart. I, of course, want my books to help to broaden academic questions and to help to answer questions that scholars continue to ask. But I also want them to be read by non-academics. It's everyone's greatest dream that their work matters to contemporary readers and readers outside the academy. And when you're talking about something as polarizing as the relationship between Jews, Ukrainians, and Russians, you can't help but have that be political. And over the last couple of years, it's become more political than it was before. I don't think we can get away from that, and I don't necessarily want to get away from that. I think it's our job as conscientious citizens of the world to think about what we mean when we write about the relationship between, say, Jews and Ukrainians. What I hope to do with my work is to ask big questions, to sometimes talk about a third way. We think about, well, there's, who was right in which case, and, was it really that bad, or was it better, or was, and certainly we're trying to find out the fact of the matter. But I think we're also in talking, for example, about the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians, talking about a very complex relationship. And the more we can integrate the very good histories that have been done of Jewish and Ukrainian relations, the more we can discuss the intersections between those two cultures rather than talking about each one in isolation. And it is a political act, but I hope it's an act that also diffuses politics in some sense. I think part of what literary scholarship does is it helps us to be comfortable with discomfort. It helps us to sit with something that cannot be easily answered in black and white. Can I unwrite the history of 1648? Absolutely not. Can I take out the fact that the Khmelnytsky uprising was deeply important to Ukrainian nationhood and also has made its way into Jewish liturgy as one of the tragedies of Jewish history? I can't take that out. It's simply, it's simply a fact of history that remains. I think that the difficulty that Jews and Ukrainians have had with one another doesn't just involve Jews and Ukrainians. I think that once you introduce the element of the Russian Empire, which certainly subordinated both cultures, it becomes that much more complex. But I also want to resist the urge to ascribe all responsibility to some other empire, to say the Russian Empire or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's historically it's too easy to do that. And so I'm going to dodge your question by saying I don't want to make it uncomplicated. I think we need to be okay moving forward with absorbing the complexities of the past. I think that for the most part today, we're really dealing with a very fragile situation right now as well. This is not an academic conversation about, who did what in the 17th century or even in the 20th century. Right now we're actually talking about a high stakes game of figuring out how moving forward Jews and Ukrainians will view self-determinacy in Ukraine, for example. And what is the responsibility of the United States to Ukraine, for example? And I think only when history is something that can continue to be probed and discussed in nuanced and sometimes painful ways, can we address a future relationship. And I think a lot of academics are doing really wonderful work with, again, reading across borders, understanding the subjecthood of, for example, those peasants who were simply peasants in the 17th century trying to gain more rights, or trying to understand the situation of, hundreds and thousands of Jews who found themselves in the Pale of Settlement and were trying to make a home there in the Slavic lands. And so it's a sensitive topic because because nationhood in those regions is still relevant. And again, I realize I'm in some ways dodging your question. I'm not willing to say, well, here's the fact of the matter, and I'm going to sort it all out for you easily. But what I can say is history shouldn't be uncomplicated. But what's worth approaching is the way that national memory can sometimes be simplified for the purposes of group solidarity, and it's worth approaching those national memories with a healthy skepticism, with the ability to think about those stories on broader terms. And again, that's the work that informs all of my scholarship as a scholar of Eastern European literature, who myself, I really, in my own work, I resist the temptation to look at single language literary studies or single language literary fields, much as it would be easier to go into depth if I did that. I feel that my own work as a literary scholar has to be across those borders. I think there's always work to be done, and I think it's always possible to go deeper. I think the relationship between the historical relationship, that coexistence between Jews and Ukrainians, is really a fascinating one, and it becomes a case study for other places in the world as well. We have a number of really good studies of the relationship between peoples that are coexisting with one another, and the advantage of Jewish and Ukrainian writers and the way that they've documented each other is that there is a very rich literary history in each of these traditions. And so it's, there's always more to be examined. I've looked at the territory in Ukraine, at least in my first book, I looked at the territory of Ukraine that overlapped with the Tsarist Empire. I resisted looking at Western Ukraine, which followed different rules at that point. Now we're talking about Galician and Habsburg writers and so forth, and so that's a somewhat different case study. But I actually think that the stories about literary relations between Jews and Ukrainians are, I think there are more to be done. I think there are more to be studied. I think that this, once a field is sort of scratched and probed, sometimes that's when the really interesting work is there to be done. I would love to see more work done on translation scholarship. I'd love to see more translations done, but I'd also love to see more work on those translations done. What do those Ukrainian translators do when they approach a Yiddish text or a Hebrew text? What are the stories to be told? I guess if there's one thing to be added that you ask about whether we're done, whether we've really gotten into the topic of Jewish and Ukrainian, the Jewish-Ukrainian relationship, I think it's an important one right now because I think we saw in 2014, and I think we're continuing to see very simplified terms like, bandyrovцы that are bandied about either in positive ways or in negative ways, depending on which community is using that. And then, of course, we have new epithets that have arisen, like Жидовандерівець, that themselves become fascinating and problematic in their own right. And I think that in order to tease out the relationship right now between, let's say, the right and the left in Eastern Europe, it is worth going back and revisiting what did happen in the 1940s? What is the history of that relationship? What were the factors that influenced the relationship between, say, Jews and Ukrainians in the 30s and 40s? What was the fallout of that? It's a history that's still in the making, and so I would love to see. I would love to see more collaborative scholarship done between Jewish and Ukrainian studies scholars. These are two very well-documented and well-researched fields that have a lot to gain from one another.